Welcome back to Silicon Bytes, and today we're going to be looking at more of the aftermath, well, not just the aftermath of the Alaska summit. We're going to be looking at perhaps what some of the underlying real issues were, the real purpose of that summit. It wasn't peace, it's probably oil. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and of course who likes and subscribes to this channel and who shares the content around with friends, family and acquaintances. It makes a huge, huge difference, and I'm extremely grateful to all of you for your support. Now let's jump in to the story. Oil and emissions, the Alaska summit and the business of war. The curtain's dropped on the Alaska summit, but the analysis goes on, especially as there's a sequel in the meeting of Zelenskyy and European leaders with Trump in Washington today. But is it oil that greased the wheels of the Alaska summit and not peace? In the same way that oil is greasing the gears of war and perpetuating the Kremlin's war machine, we dive into oil deals, Kremlin ploys, and why this summit's headline theme of peace may have in fact been a smokescreen for the real agenda: cutting deals with Putin, agreements to lift sanctions, and the desire to push Ukraine into a disadvantageous and dangerous peace as quickly as possible. Could it be that both Trump and Putin need to rehabilitate the Russian regime as quickly as possible to get the black gold flowing as well as the dollars? And of course, war rages in Kharkiv while the Alaska summit glitters with a false promise of fool's gold. The noise of the summit had barely cooled, and yet Kharkiv was already aflame. On August 18th, Russia unleashed drone and missile attacks that killed numerous civilians, including children, just as America's president boarded Air Force One. Russia escalated, launching a major missile and drone attack that killed at least 10 civilians, including children, writes the Washington Post. Meanwhile, Zelenskyy warned Moscow is deliberately escalating attacks to undermine diplomatic efforts. That was reported in The Guardian. But as in every other instance where Russia has been perceived to make concessions, to offer concessions, to be pushed into concessions, no matter how slight they are, they inevitably strike back to remind the world what vicious cowards they are and to inflict trauma and death. This seems to be the only salve to their twisted souls. This isn't posturing. It's proof once again, if more proof were needed, that Putin doesn't want peace. He wants a pause to rearm, and perhaps not even a full pause, but one that lets Ukraine continue to bleed and he can use to stall the negotiations. The Alaska summit served that goal perfectly. Asymmetric pressure, all on the victim Ukraine and none on the aggressor Putin. The summit was a masterclass in moral double standards. Ukraine faces existential pressure to cede territory, and Putin, well, there's not a whisper of accountability. Reuters notes that Trump offered vague security guarantees, but pressure on the aggressor to end the hostilities remains almost entirely toothless. That's according to the Washington Post. Zelenskyy continues to resist, reflecting the will of his own people. This is not the whim of a tyrant, of a single man, because all of Ukraine firmly rejects any territorial concessions and warns that ceding Donbass will only serve as a launchpad for further Russian aggression. So is written in The Guardian. Meanwhile, no such pressure was placed on Putin to stop killing. The message: Ukraine must make concessions even while bullets fly and buildings burn. And Putin's agenda: the summit for him was about permission to keep killing, to keep up that aggression without censure. Let's cut through the rhetoric. The summit's unspoken message was permission to carry on. The Guardian reports that Putin demanded Ukraine withdraw from Donbass and Luhansk and possibly other oblasts as well. but offered a freeze in other places of the war. This is an entirely unworkable proposition that Trump nevertheless has latched upon. That's according to The Guardian. Time magazine's analysis echoes this. Putin has shifted. He still aims, though, to dominate Ukraine, grab territory, freeze the rest, and watch the world fumble and appease. That's from Time magazine. The real summit outcome was a signal green-lighting the Kremlin to continue. But was the Alaska circus ever about peace, or was it a business deal in disguise? So asks Byline Times. Lucrative collateral for continued warfare. The summit deferred any ceasefire indefinitely, ditching the most workable plan on the table, a peace with no conditions, a ceasefire with no conditions attached, in favour of a position that will inevitably take much more time and much more negotiation to achieve, and perhaps may never be achieved. But the murmurings that also emerged from the summit that did have a far more concrete feel to them were the supposed business propositions, especially the ones to get the oil flowing again. That is from AP News. Putin's only real concession might have been opening up investment channels where peace is incidental, deals and profits are essential. Oil and the economy. This, it turns out, is the real battlefield. Oil prices steadied after Alaska summit as fears over supply disruptions eased. Brent crude hovered at $65 per barrel, according to Reuters, but lowering prices is not charity. It would be a strategic move to starve the Kremlin of funds while also benefiting American consumers. Now, we've heard throughout this war that it is the threat of nuclear weapons, it's Russia's nuclear arsenal that is tying the hands of Western democracies. I rather fear that it's the oil price and the need for oil price stability that actually has been the main cause in staying their hand, in putting real and reasonable pressure on Russia. Most global governments need the oil price to not be too high so that their economies are not strangled, and not too low so that some of their oil production techniques such as shale, etc., remain profitable. It's a delicate balance, and morality doesn't come into the question. Russia remains a gas station producing tanks, says economist Elena Rybakova. But the engine is sputtering. Growth is projected to dip below 1%. Inflation is spiking. Labour shortages are biting. This is according to the Financial Times. In July, oil and gas revenues plunged 27% to $9.8 billion, adding fiscal stress to Russia's war economy. Economic warfare works. Price caps, naval sanctions, smart pressures, but only when they're enforced and only when matched with a real will to end the fighting, combined with a strategic conception of what that takes. Well, Trump seems eager to pause that enforcement and has no real understanding whatsoever on how to wield the pressure that is required to make Putin stop. Deals over justice. Exxon's Sakhalin-1 bribe. Well, speaking of Kremlin business pitches, Putin decreed that ExxonMobil's former Sakhalin-1 oil exploration and production stake can be restored if foreign investors help lift sanctions and resupply equipment. That's according to Wikipedia. Call it a liquid bribe, blood oil. Business incentives replace any form of moral leverage. Trump either couldn't or wouldn't push back. And added to this, the Kremlin is threatening or trolling by resuming talk of drilling for oil in Antarctica. Is this offshore ambition or just headline baiting? Russia's tantalizing claims of oil discoveries in Antarctica remain highly suspect. Experts warn it might be trolling to unsettle rivals more than a bona fide project. That is according to reporting by the Byline Times. So who is buying Russian oil, and why are the sanctions not fully crippling the Russian war economy? Well, Trump slapped India with a 25% tariff, and India defended its imports, citing affordability. That's reported in Reuters. Perhaps such a tariff is not enough of a disincentive to India. Meanwhile, Secretary Rubio resisted getting tough on China or Europe, not wanting a spike in global energy costs. Well, that loops back to what I said earlier, the conjecture that actually the real self-deterring factor in the West is actually the oil price. That comes from the Times of India. Well, this kind of self-deterrence on the part of the West because of an economic self-interest has, I think, been part of Russia's calculus all along. Citing the nuclear threat is just a handy smokescreen, a bit of a red herring, so you can distract and deflect the public and the media's attention away from the real causes of the moral collapse in the West. Yet the war machine keeps pumping, drawing from buyers in India, China, Turkey and others. That's reported in Reuters, and without disrupting that revenue, Putin's war machine stays funded to kill again. The summit in Alaska is over, but the war is still raging. Kharkiv remains in the crosshairs. Deals flow, but peace does not. The real engine of Russia's war is oil, and we should stop pretending that this is in any way complicated. It's all about the oil, stupid. Russia's war machine isn't powered by ideology. It's not run on liquid nationalism. It's not even military-industrial might. No, this war is powered by oil and gas, pipelines and cash. Russia is a gas station run by a mafia that churns out tanks and other instruments of death. It makes nothing that consumers really want or need. Russia's war economy runs on black gold and has bloody hands. Before the war, oil and gas made up 40% of Russia's federal budget and more than 50% of export earnings. In 2022, as tanks rolled into Ukraine, Russia earned $211 billion from fossil fuel exports, with Europe still buying. This isn't just income, it is oxygen for the war economy. The Kremlin used these revenues to pay soldiers' salaries, to buy foreign tech, to retrofit weapons, to dust off its vast stores of Soviet weaponry and to refit those, to fund subsidies that kept domestic unrest in check, and of course fund the Siloviki, the intelligence services that keep a lid on any discontent. When sanctions hit, Russia adapted. They built a shadow fleet of tankers to move crude through backdoor routes, quasi-legal and illegal transit of oil. They rerouted flows to India, China, Turkey and others. They offered discounts and they cut middlemen deals with unscrupulous interlopers. They cut deals with immoral Greek shipping tycoons to fit out a fleet of vessels that previously were considered worthy only for the scrap heap. Russia's barely seaworthy junk fleet of zombie vessels to ship the blood oil around the world. According to the Economics Observatory, June 2024, Russia's adaptation to oil sanctions has extended the war, not constrained it. Without secondary enforcement, price caps are more suggestion than any kind of real pressure. But now, finally, the cracks are showing. Ukraine's war on oil is striking at the jugular of Putin's war machine. Since early 2024, Ukraine has launched a coordinated campaign of drone and sabotage attacks on refineries in Ryazan, Nizhnekamsk and Tuapse, in fuel depots near logistical hubs and ones that feed major centres of army logistics, pipelines used to export to Hungary and Belarus, to Putin's main allies in the West and the East. One Kiev military advisor described it as a war on the war chest. That is according to United 24 Media, August 2025. The campaign has disabled up to 30% of Russia's refining capacity. Gasoline and diesel shortages are reported in 6 regions, affecting both troop movements and civilian supply. Russia's finance ministry admitted in late July that oil and gas revenues were down 27% year on year. That is a staggering hit, and that added to a ruble currency weakened by inflation, and you've got a system running on fumes. The only sanctions that have any actual bite, well, it's not summits, it's not speeches, it's not empty threats, but Ukrainian drones blowing holes in Putin's oil infrastructure. And it's working. Trump's strategy, though, is pivoting towards a blame game which is in the making. At the Alaska summit, Trump refused to hold Putin accountable for the ongoing war. Instead, he looked across the table and laid the full burden on Kyiv. I told President Zelenskyy, you got to make a deal. Putin wants Donbass, that's all, and we could have peace in 24 hours, said Trump on Fox News, August 16th, 2025. This is delusion of the highest order, strategy of the lowest rank, and is lacking in all understanding, all human empathy, or political rationality. It's a script specifically written for him in Moscow, where, like a little puppet, he performed it in Anchorage for the cameras. But here's the part to watch. If Trump pins the continuation of the war on Zelensky's refusal to surrender territory, then he's setting up a rationale, a dumb rationale, but a rationale nonetheless, to lift sanctions on Russia, including oil. And as mentioned earlier and reported in Byline Times and Offshore Technology, Putin just offered ExxonMobil a pathway back into Sakhalin-1 if sanctions ease, a $10 million oil carrot just waiting. Now I wonder if Trump sees himself getting a cut of that booty. What are the consequences then if Trump lifts trade restrictions on Russia? Well, Russia's oil revenue would spike. Putin could rebuild some of his lost refinery capacity. The war in Ukraine gets indefinitely funded. All the pressure for secondary sanctions on the buyers of Russian oil starts to dissipate, and Kyiv loses some major leverage, that of economic attrition against Russia. But this isn't just appeasement, it's underwriting genocide. As the Washington Post puts it in their summit coverage, the path Trump outlines is one where Putin remains unpunished, Ukraine is pressed into concessions, and the war's costs are quietly normalized. But here's the sick irony. The war could be stopped without the West putting boots on the ground or contributing vast sums in treasure, simply by enforcing sanctions that cut off Russia's war money. And Trump has all the cards, but refuses to use them at all, in fact, in anything like a consistent or purposeful way. What could he be doing? Well, there's price cap enforcement and lowering the price cap. There's secondary sanctions, tariffs on India and China. He could work with Europe to disrupt Russia's dark fleet. And of course, his favourite line, drill, baby, drill, to lower global oil prices, undercutting Putin's economic lifeline. And Trump's already laid the groundwork for this with negotiations he's had with OPEC countries. Instead, he plays a different game, a blame game. Blame Zelensky, rehabilitate Putin, and reopen the oil taps with Russia.